The Seine lay heavy beneath a sky the colour of wet slate, its waters sliding past the stone quays as though reluctant to reveal what secrets they carried. A thin fog curled upward, wrapping itself around the lamps that dotted the embankment, blurring the outlines of men who walked with collars turned high against the night air. Somewhere downriver, a tug's whistle moaned, low and mournful, echoing against the walls of the old city like a summons from another world. And above it all, the steady rhythm of footsteps approached the Quai des Orfèvres, where Inspector Maigret, pipe clenched between his teeth, paused before the great wooden door, sensing before even crossing the threshold that the night had decided to turn its face toward mystery. Before we step fully into this world of fog-drenched alleys, smoke-filled cafes and telegrams that arrive with unnerving precision, allow yourself a moment to remain close. If the quiet weight of Maigret's Paris draws you in, if the pulse of hidden crimes and unspoken truths fascinates you, then I ask you, without breaking the spell, to linger with us. Like the faint glow of a street lamp that burns longer when watched, your support, subscribing, sharing, leaving a sign of your presence, ensures these stories continue to burn against the darkness. The clocks at the Gare de Lyon had never agreed with one another. One stood stubbornly a minute slow, the other impatiently fast, and though countless travellers must have noticed, none had ever thought to ask why. Perhaps the station itself conspired in this small deceit, for its great cavernous hall, echoing with footsteps and the shouts of porters, had always seemed suspended between times, neither entirely of the modern, with its electric lamps that hummed faintly overhead, nor of the past, with its soot-stained stone and heavy timbers blackened by years of smoke from trains that arrived like thunder. It was between these two clocks that a man disappeared. He had been seen buying a ticket for Dijon at precisely 6 o'clock, his fingers fumbling with coins that clinked nervously against the wood of the counter. He was tall but narrow in the shoulders, wearing a hat that seemed to weigh on him as though borrowed. The clerk, later questioned, could not recall his eyes, only the peculiar way he folded the ticket twice before slipping it into his coat, as though wanting to hide not merely paper, but intent. At 6:02, when the fast clock struck, he walked across the concourse with measured steps, a small leather valise in hand. At 6:03, when the slow clock finally caught up, he was gone. No one saw him pass the barriers, no one saw him board a train, and yet the ticket in Dijon was never presented. Maigret heard of it only the following morning, summoned not by telegram, but by the persistent voice of a station inspector who arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres in person, hat in hand, his coat damp from fog. The man spoke with the stiff precision of one used to timetables, convinced that something more than error had unfolded beneath his roof. "An hour vanished, Monsieur le Commissaire," he declared, though the words came awkwardly, as if he himself did not believe them. "And with it, a man." Maigret, pipe between his teeth, listened in silence. He had been standing near the window of his office, watching the Seine churn sluggishly below, its surface dappled by the first weak rays of sunlight. Paris was just beginning to stir, carts rumbling over the cobblestones, a milkman's cry rising faintly from a side street. The inspector's tale, with its talk of clocks and missing men, might have sounded like a curiosity fit for a newspaper column, the sort of story that readers devoured with their morning coffee before forgetting. Yet Maigret felt the heaviness behind the words, the peculiar insistence that this was not a case of distraction or mistake, but of something more deliberate, more troubling. By the time he arrived at the station, the hall had already filled with its usual chaos. Women in dark shawls clutched baskets of provisions, students hurried with books under their arms, soldiers, loitered in small groups, their laughter carrying through the arches. The smell of coal smoke and oil hung thick in the air, mixing with the damp chill of the platforms. Maigret walked slowly, his eyes half-lidded, absorbing the rhythm of the place, the cadence of voices, the pattern of movement. He did not rush to question, he let the atmosphere seep into him first, like smoke into cloth. The clerk remembered the man clearly enough to describe his hands, which trembled slightly as he counted the coins, and the porter swore he had lifted the valise only briefly, finding it unexpectedly light, as though empty. But after that moment, the trail dissolved into confusion. Some thought they had seen him walk toward the Dijon train. Others claimed he veered toward the waiting room, while one woman insisted he had stepped outside entirely, swallowed by the mist of the square. Maigret listened without interrupting, jotting nothing down, his pipe sending up small spirals that mingled with the station's haze. It was in the waiting room, however, that Maigret lingered longest. The wooden benches bore the marks of years of restless passengers, initials carved into their surfaces, dark stains from spilled wine or ink. In a corner near the stove sat an elderly man with a white beard, his eyes watery, his clothes threadbare. He had been there the night before, he said, dozing in and out of sleep. And yes, he remembered the stranger, not for his faces blurred for him now, but for the silence that clung to him. Most men, when they wait, they cough, they sigh, they shuffle, the old man murmured. This one sat as if he were listening, not to the station, but to something inside himself. And then he rose, and he was gone. Outside, Maigret paused beneath the wide arch that opened onto the square. The fog still lingered, though thinner now, trailing in wisps around the horse-drawn carriages and the few motor cars that rattled past. He lit his pipe again, drawing slowly, his mind turning over the fragments. A man buying a ticket, but never using it. A valise that weighed almost nothing. 2 clocks that refused to agree on the same minute. It might all have amounted to coincidence, to nothing at all. And yet he felt the weight of it, the same way he could sense a shift in weather before rain began to fall. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, reports began to arrive. A landlady in Montmartre claimed her tenant, a certain Monsieur André Morel, had not returned home since the previous evening, though his coat and papers remained. In Dijon, a telegram confirmed no passenger of his description had alighted. The name Morel carried with it a faint familiarity, the kind that nagged without revealing why. Maigret stood by the window once more, pipe in hand, watching the river drift past, and let the pieces settle in his thoughts. What kind of man buys a ticket he does not intend to use? What kind of man carries a valise that contains nothing? And why choose to vanish between 2 clocks as though time itself offered the passage? Maigret did not yet have the answers, but he sensed already that this was no ordinary disappearance. It had the quality of a man trying to escape not the police, nor his creditors, but himself. That evening, as the lamps along the quay flickered to life, casting yellow halos in the mist, Maigret returned to the station alone. The hall was quieter now, the echo of footsteps softer, the trains fewer. He stood once more between the 2 clocks, watching their hands creep forward, out of rhythm, out of agreement. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether the vanished man had slipped into the narrow space between their minutes, into that shadowy interval where time falters and a man might begin a second life. The thought clung to him as he turned his collar against the night and walked back toward the Seine, his pipe embers glowing faintly in the fog. Somewhere a man lived a life unseen, and Maigret, inexorably, would have to find which of his 2 lives had been abandoned. Montmartre had awakened, with the damp ache of a night poorly slept, the stairways slick, the cobbles sweating a thin film of mist, as if the hill itself had exhaled too long and now laboured to draw breath again. The Rue des Trois Frères rose in a tired curve, its facades stained by decades of smoke and rain, shutters askew, the smell of boiled cabbage and black coffee seeping through thin doors. A ragman's cry climbed the slope, trailing after him like a frayed ribbon. Maigret, his hat pulled low and his thick coat buttoned to the neck, took the hill slowly, letting the street compose itself around him with the unhurried frankness of a face that has nothing left to hide. The lodging-house announced itself not with a sign, for its painted letters had long ago peeled away, but with the weary bow of its steps and the cracked pane in the entry where someone had pressed a hand too hard. Inside, a narrow corridor led toward a staircase that had learned the particular creak of each tenant. Damp had gathered at the corners like little obstinate colonies. He could hear someone coughing behind a door, the cough of not enough warmth and not enough luck, and the faint clink of crockery, as if a spoon moved inside an empty cup for comfort alone. The landlady waited at the foot of the stairs, smudged apron knotted over a thickened figure, her hair pinned as if to keep more than strands in place. She introduced herself as Madame Lenoir, and looked not at his eyes, but at the pipe in his coat pocket, as though measuring him by the habit it implied. She led him up 2 flights, the second step near the landing protesting underfoot. "Monsieur Morel keeps to himself," she said, though the verb slipped in the past tense despite her effort. Kept. The correction fell softly, then disappeared, as if swallowed by the narrow walls. "Always on time with the rent. Always with the good mornings and the good evenings. Nothing to say." Her voice sharpened with that last nothing, as if absence were an offence, and Maigret watched the back of her neck, the small muscle that tightened above her collar whenever she lied to herself first, and the world second. The corridor on the 3rd floor strained a little to remain straight, bending toward the window like a reed under wind. Madame Lenoir stopped before a door that had been painted too often in a brown that never matched itself. She drew a key from her pocket and hesitated, as though some ceremony must precede the turn of metal in a lock. "You understand, Monsieur le Commissaire, I would not disturb a tenant's room without reason," she said, and in the same breath shaped the key to the keyhole and pushed inward, with a pleased little clicking sound that suggested she had, at one time or another, opened doors for reasons that were her own. The room offered itself the way a spare face does, with nothing excess to distract the eye. A small bed with its iron frame cool to the touch, the covers drawn up neatly, as if morning had not dared undo what night arranged. A table with a green bottle turned to catch light, and a glass in which a thin crescent of wine still clung. A wash-basin with a chip bitten out of its lip. Against the wall, a trunk waited, its leather straps worn but strong, the brass lock polished by fingers that liked things orderly. A chair stood slightly to one side, not where a man sits to rest, but where he stands to try on a coat and consider his reflection in a window pane that offers nothing trustworthy. The air held a faint odour of tobacco and starch, the aftertaste of someone who had been careful with himself. It was not the visible that troubled Maigret, but the trace of something without a name. He moved slowly, his big hands respectful, as if objects had ears. On the table, along with the bottle and the glass, lay a folded sheet of paper that had been turned face down. When he lifted it, he found not a letter, but a receipt from a tailor on Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin for alterations to a suit, sleeves shortened, waist let out by 1/2 centimetre, a collar corrected for a neck a little too proud, paid in cash. Next to the receipt, a single shirt button rested, pearly and indifferent, as if a garment had yielded that one token to prove it had been worn. He put the paper back where it had been, and let the button be. Madame Lenoir shifted her weight and made the chair creak in protest. "He didn't bring ladies here," she said, preempting a question he had not asked. Not the type. He came and went, never too late, never too early. But yesterday he left at 5 in the afternoon and poof! She opened both hands as if showing a trick whose explanation eluded her. "He did not come back. I'm not one to pry, but the police— well, if the police do not look, who will?" Maigret turned to the trunk. The porter at the Gare de Lyon had felt a valise light enough to be empty. Here was a trunk heavy enough to wait for years. He knelt and studied the lock. It had been oiled recently. The brass, though old, gleamed under the dull light of the window. He stood again and tugged at the leather handle, only testing, not opening. "Do you keep a second key to Tenant's rooms, Madame Lenoir?" he asked, his voice as gentle as a hand resting on a shoulder. Her mouth smiled, while her eyes did not. "For safety," she said. "In case of a leak or a fire, I am responsible." She produced the key again without being asked, and there was a brief, telling pride in the way she held it, head tilted, chin forward, like a woman who has tamed something that might otherwise run wild. He looked at the bed. The depression where a body had lain lingered faintly, a memory in cloth. On the chair's seat, a grey wool scarf had been folded and folded again, as if to learn obedience. He picked it up and held it to his face for a breath. There was no perfume there, nothing of flowers or powder. Instead, a clean soap, and beneath it something metallic, like the smell of keys warmed by a hand. "Did he receive letters?" Maigret asked. "Never," she said too quickly. "Or if he did, he collected them outside. The postman comes to the café on the corner, you know how it is, and sometimes the tenants don't want paper to chase them up the stairs. But in the ledger there's nothing. He paid punctually. I keep books like a priest says Mass." Her ledger lay in the living room downstairs, he knew, great loops of ink keeping time with the months. He would look at it, not for numbers, but for the shape of a handwriting, the hesitation in a date. For now he stayed with the room, as if it might speak while the landlady stood witness. Silence has its own tongue, and he had learned to listen to it. The wash-basin yielded a hair, dark and wiry, clinging to the porcelain near the drain. On the window ledge, a smear of dust had been interrupted by the outline of a small tin, the kind that holds collar stays or a stamp pad. The tin itself was absent, the trunk locked, the desk drawer unlocked but empty except for a pencil sharpened to a patient point and a telegram form unused, its printed boxes waiting like a grid someone might have meant to step into. He imagined, for a moment, the man named André Morel sitting at the table, the telegram before him, the pencil set down untouched. Who would he have written to? Who, if anyone, would have read the words and known them for his? "Where does he work?" Maigret asked. He said he was a representative. For what, he did not say. The kind who carries a case and knocks politely and never leaves mud on the floor. Not like the others. But I saw the soles of his shoes once when he placed them by the stove. They were worn where a man walks quickly and stops short. The steps of someone who changes his mind and then changes it back. She watched him watch the room. He crossed to the window and looked out at the street. Across the way, an old woman in a shawl leaned on her sill, arms folded, eyes small and sharp. He raised his gaze toward the sky that Montmartre had drawn to itself, a grey swatch pinned by chimneys, and then he turned back. Carefully he thumbed the edge of the trunk's lock a second time, measuring something that was not weight and not resistance, but the faintest play of looseness where metal meets wood. "Will you open it?" the landlady asked, as if she were asking whether a priest would lift a cloth on an altar. "Not yet," he said. "Tell me about yesterday at 5. She smoothed her apron, the gesture buying her the seconds she needed to assemble facts into a story. "He came down with his hat," she began. "And the scarf you are holding now?" "He did not greet anyone in the corridor, but he tipped his hat to me in the entry." He had the small valise, brown, the one he kept under the bed. He said, "Good evening, Madame Lenoir," though it was barely afternoon. I remarked upon it, and he smiled. Not like a man amused, like a man who has already left a room in his mind and is turning back to close a door he forgot. He went into the street. The fog had begun to come in, that is all. And no visitors before that? None that came by the stairs, but the stairs are not the only way if a person is careful. She said it as if merely stating the nature of houses in general, but a small thrill of significance coloured her tone. He looked at her for a long second, and she looked at the trunk. A neighbour's footstep passed in the corridor, hesitated, and moved on. Somewhere below, a kettle refused to boil, rattling a weak protest. He let the room breathe around them, then nodded. "I will take the scarf," he said, "and the receipt." He glanced once more at the bed, at the indentation that would recover soon enough, at the telegram form as blank as a winter field. "Keep the trunk as it is. Lock his door each evening. Tell no one that I came, except the person who will ask, and who will pretend he does not care for the answer." She frowned. "Who is that?" "The person who knows what is in the trunk," he said, and at that she lifted a hand to her mouth, but the sound she made was not a gasp. It was the breath of someone who recognizes a truth that has been sitting like a silent guest. When he left the room, the corridor's walls seemed to close up to the width of his shoulders. On the landing, he paused long enough to strike a match against the worn strip of wood, cupping the flame so it would not hesitate, and set his pipe to life. The stair complained as he descended. Madame Lenoir followed, rescuing dignity from suspicion by reminding him without words that she kept order in a place the city forgot. In the small front room where she received rents, he asked for the ledger, and she gave it as if it might absolve her. He traced the lines with a thick forefinger. Morel had arrived 3 months earlier. He paid always on the second day of the month, in notes, not coins, and he wrote his name with care, removing personality from his hand as if from his face. On the page he found another name, written smaller, a tenant on the floor above, Léon Prachet, a turner by trade, recently unemployed. The last payment was overdue. Beside it the landlady had drawn a neat circle instead of a cross, a habit, perhaps, of indicating debt without invoking death. "He keeps to his room?" Maigret asked. "He keeps to the café," she said dryly. "His room keeps to him." Then, catching herself, she added, "A pity. He was decent before the workshop closed." He thanked her and stepped into the street once more. The air had hardened into a chill that put teeth in it. He glanced up at the windows. Behind one, the old woman still stood, her gaze as steady as a tax collector's. He imagined her eyes moving across the tenants' lives, tallying comings and goings, the way a cat tracks moths. And he thought of the trunk again, of the metal bright to the touch, of the lock that would yield with less persuasion than it pretended. At the corner café, with its zinc counter gleaming like a wet blade, he found the postman talking to the patron, hands spread on the bar to show he held nothing. They looked up as Maigret entered, and a hush passed through the place that was not fear, but the recognition of a man who seeks answers and is not in a hurry to be lied to. He ordered a calvados and asked, in the plain voice of a man asking for a light, whether Monsieur Morel ever collected letters here. The patron glanced at the postman, who frowned as if the question insulted his memory. "A postcard once," he said at last. "No stamp, hand-delivered. That was a week ago. A view of the sea, though I could not say which." He looked at it for a long time and then did not take it. He asked me to keep it behind the counter, but the next day it was gone. "Who took it?" Maigret asked. The patron lifted his shoulders. A man's shrug can be a gate that opens onto many streets. "I keep a café," he said. "The door swings, arms reach, eyes do not always follow." When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the river had darkened to a long strip of iron. He carried under his coat the scarf and the receipt, small objects in a city of larger, louder facts. Yet he felt them heavy in his pocket, the way a single word in a conversation can weigh more than an hour of talk. Janvier was at his desk, mapping the sentences of a report as a man might lay tracks. Lucas stood by the stove, palms to the heat, his attention like an open door. "A trunk," Maigret said simply, "a key that fits too easily, a man who left early for an evening he never reached. And a postcard of the sea that wished not to be kept." He did not say more. Sometimes words are like cats. They do not come when called, they come when they please. He stood by the window and watched the lamps along the quay smudge the fog. Somewhere in the hill of Montmartre, a lock waited to be turned by a hand that could no longer wait. Somewhere on a counter, a postcard had completed a journey by vanishing. And in a room on Rue des Trois Frères, the air kept the shape of a man who had left a little too carefully, as if hoping the room would not notice. Night tightened its knot, and the case, very softly, tightened with it. The trunk would open, and when it did, the second life would breathe its first small sound. The café was not one of those bright establishments with polished brass and white tablecloths, where clerks from the nearby offices came to spend their francs in the middle of the day. It crouched on the corner of a sloping street in Montmartre, its windows streaked with the greasy film of smoke and rain, the glass cloudy enough to blur the faces inside. Above the door, a sign once painted blue had faded to the uncertain shade of a bruise. The zinc counter stretched like a dull, wet blade, scarred from years of elbows and coins, and the mirror behind it had warped until every reflection trembled faintly, as though each man who looked there was condemned to see himself already distorted by time. It was here that Maigret came, his large figure pressing the fog before him, his pipe extinguished by the damp and the climb. He entered with the slowness of someone not accustomed to rushing into warmth, letting the smell of tobacco and anise rise toward him, letting the murmur of voices wrap him as a coat wraps shoulders. A few heads lifted and then bent again to their glasses, but the patron behind the counter, a man with hair the colour of ash and hands darkened by years of polishing metal, straightened and nodded. Maigret returned the nod and moved to the end of the counter, where the mirror caught him, bent his outline slightly, and handed it back as if to remind him that truth rarely arrived unaltered. He ordered a glass of beer, though the day still clung to its morning hour, and let the liquid sit until the foam dissolved, the glass sweating a small circle onto the zinc. He was not thirsty, he was listening. The café spoke in half-phrases in the scrape of chairs, in the shuffle of cards slapped onto a table where three men in workmen's jackets leaned forward, their eyes darting from the cards to the door. A woman in a hat with a frayed ribbon sat near the stove, staring into her empty cup as if it might fill again by pity alone. The postman Maigret had seen the evening before pass through, greeted the patron with a raised hand, and left without lingering. It was not what people said, but what they avoided saying that interested him. At last he spoke to the patron. "A man came here often, perhaps sat where I am now. André Morel." He did not pose it as a question, but as though he were placing a stone on a table and waiting to see if others would recognize its weight. The patron wiped the counter, though it was already clean. "He came," he admitted. "Always alone, never more than one drink, never less than 1 franc left. Polite, that is all." "But you remember him?" Maigret said softly. The patron's eyes flickered toward the mirror, as if searching for permission. "I remember he looked as though he were measuring the room, as though he wanted to be certain who entered and who left. Some men come to forget themselves. He came to watch himself go by." At the table near the stove, the woman in the frayed hat stirred though her cup remained empty. She had been listening. Maigret turned slightly, heavy shoulders shifting with the movement. "Madame?" he asked. "Did you know him?" She smiled with lips that cracked at the edges. "Knew him? He never spoke to me. But he looked." Her laugh was short and bitter. "Not in the way men look when they want something. He looked as if I reminded him of someone else. Perhaps I was a ghost for him." The mirror behind the counter gave back her image too, wavering as if under water, a reflection unfaithful in small, cruel ways. Maigret let the silence hold a moment before he asked, "When did you see him last?" 3 days ago," she said. "He was early. He came before the men from the workshop, before the noise. He ordered coffee but barely touched it. He sat with his hand on the valise, the small brown one, like a man ready to leave, though he had nowhere to go." The patron added, almost reluctantly, "And he asked for a telephone. Mine was broken. He went to the one across the street." Maigret drank a sip of his beer at last, the bitterness sharp, grounding. Across the street the telephone booth stood like a sentry in its glass cage, a little red curtain pulled half shut. He imagined Morel inside, coin in hand, dialing slowly, listening to a voice that might have answered in a room he had abandoned. And afterward he imagined the man returning, sitting before the warped mirror, seeing himself altered by a conversation no one else had heard. "Did anyone see him after that?" Maigret asked. The woman shook her head. The men at the card table muttered, shuffled, pretended not to listen. One of them dropped a card that slid face up onto the floor, the jack of spades grinning crookedly. The patron bent and picked it up, laid it back in the man's hand without a word. The mirror caught all of it, made each gesture tremble. Maigret smoked then, relighting his pipe with a match struck against the counter's edge. He exhaled slowly, filling the café with a blue haze that mingled with the others. His eyes softened, as though he were not watching anyone in particular, and yet he noticed the small flick of a man's gaze toward the door, the way the woman's hands folded tightly in her lap, the nervous beat of fingers on the zinc. It was as if the café itself waited, restless under its own mirror, for something to break. When he rose at last, his beer unfinished, he placed a coin carefully on the counter. The patron caught his sleeve for the briefest second. "Commissaire," he said, almost whispering, "men do not vanish because they wish to. Something pushes them, perhaps here, perhaps elsewhere. But he left as if someone had already decided for him." Outside, the fog had lifted, leaving the street raw under the pale sun. The telephone booth stood deserted, its glass smeared with fingerprints. A child bounced a ball against the wall nearby, each thud echoing down the cobbles like a clock, striking time that no one could agree upon. Maigret paused, pipe in hand, watching the ball rise and fall, until at last it slipped into a gutter and disappeared. The child bent, peered, shrugged, and went away, leaving absence in his wake. Maigret turned back once, to the café with its restless mirror, and thought of Morel, sitting there, a man half in one life, half in another, reflected and refracted, until even he could not be certain which face belonged to him. Somewhere the trail led forward, not with the certainty of facts, but with the uneasy murmur of half-seen gestures, half-heard words. He began walking downhill toward the Seine, the city opening before him with its 1,000 windows, each hiding a life, each capable of swallowing one whole. And in his mind, like the smoke from his pipe, the question lingered: had Morel come to the café to meet someone, or merely to watch his reflection until it no longer matched the man who bore it? The answer lay not in what had been said, but in what the mirror, restless and cruel, had refused to keep. The telegram had been waiting for him when he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres that evening. A boy in uniform, cap still askew from the drizzle outside, had delivered it with the resigned air of one who knows the words he carries never bring joy. The paper was yellow, its folds already softened by damp hands, the ink smudged in places where someone, perhaps the boy himself, had brushed against it. Maigret took it without a word, pipe dangling from the corner of his mouth, and opened it slowly, the way one peels an orange, savouring the delay though the taste may prove bitter. It read simply: "No passenger of description arrived, no ticket presented, stop. Platform inspected, nothing found, stop. Dijon station." The words stood like soldiers at attention, brusque, mechanical, carrying nothing of the unease that must have pressed on the man who sent them. And yet, between those clipped syllables, stretched a chasm. A ticket bought in Paris, a journey announced, and a man who had vanished somewhere in the interval, as though Dijon itself had decided to remain innocent of his arrival. Maigret folded the telegram once, then twice, slipping it into his breast pocket, where it lay against his heart with the weight of silence. He leaned on the window-sill, staring down at the Seine as night gathered over it, the water turning from pewter to black velvet. The lights on the opposite bank flared into halos through the mist, their reflections trembling as if uncertain of their own solidity. Somewhere in that trembling, in the void between Paris and Dijon, a man lived or did not live, and the truth lay suspended like a coat left on a hook. The next morning he took the train himself, not because Dijon promised clarity, but because the rails stretched like veins across the country, carrying both the innocent and the guilty, and he wished to feel the rhythm beneath his feet. The carriage smelled of coal and damp wool. Across from him, a priest dozed, head nodding with each sway of the train. A young couple whispered urgently, their hands never still, fingers entwining and separating as if rehearsing partings. Maigret smoked in silence, the window pane cold against his temple, and watched the countryside slip by, fields stripped of harvest, villages clinging to the edges of roads, church steeples stabbing upward as if to protest the fog. At Dijon, the station spread itself with the self-importance of a provincial hub, long platforms, a clock tower proud of its punctuality, porters hurrying with practiced briskness. Yet here, too, under the sharp smell of steam and iron, there was the same void. No one remembered a man with a narrow face and a valise light as an empty box. The clerks shuffled their registers. The guards shook their heads. The ticket collector swore that no unused ticket for Paris-Dijon had been found. The man who had bought passage never presented himself to be checked, never took a seat in the compartments, never stepped onto the platform at journey's end. Maigret stood on the platform as another train sighed into the station, passengers descending like figures from a stage, each carrying with them stories, excuses, lies, truths. He let them pass, his bulk rooted to the spot, the stem of his pipe clamped between his teeth. It was not Dijon that concerned him, but the space in between, the hours measured by the train's wheels on their tracks. Somewhere along those kilometers, the man had dissolved. He might have stepped off at a smaller station, melted into the crowd, or he might never have boarded at all, disappearing in Paris like a coin slipped into a pocket. The telegram had not solved the riddle, it had deepened it. That afternoon he walked the streets of Dijon, not in hope of finding Morel, but to let the city impress itself upon him. The houses with their steep tiled roofs leaned close to the narrow lanes. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds with stiff brooms. Children in short coats skipped rope until a schoolmistress clapped her hands and called them inside. It was an honest city, provincial in its rhythms, where a stranger would be noticed. Yet when he asked, discreetly, no one remembered a man arriving alone with a valise. The cafes offered him indifferent wine and the news that Parisian disappearances were best left to Paris. As dusk fell, Maigret returned to the station and sat in the waiting room, its wooden benches polished by countless weary travellers. The stove in the corner coughed smoke. The air smelled of coal and coffee. He imagined Morel here, sitting with the valise between his knees, glancing at the clock that did not lie as the Paris clocks did, wondering if he had chosen the right life to abandon. But the image would not hold. Morel had never arrived. The telegram had assured him of that. The return journey to Paris weighed heavier. Darkness pressed against the windows. His reflection stared back at him, blurred and vast. He thought of the trunk in the room on Rue des Trois Frères, locked yet yielding to fingers that wanted too much. He thought of the café with its restless mirror, where Morel had sat with the valise, as though waiting for someone to give him permission to leave himself behind. And he thought of the telegram, that sterile slip of paper, more eloquent in what it omitted than in what it said. Back in Paris, the city greeted him with drizzle and the sour smell of wet stone. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas handed him another note. The landlady, Madame Lenoir, had sent word that someone had asked after Morel that very morning, a man she did not recognize, tall, with a narrow moustache and a coat too fine for the neighborhood. He had not given his name, had not insisted, merely asked whether Morel was in and, when told no, had walked away without protest. Maigret read the note slowly, then tucked it beside the telegram, two scraps of paper that together carried more shadow than light. He poured himself a glass of rough brandy and sat at his desk, pipe smoke thickening the room until the lamplight wavered. A man buys a ticket, a man does not use it. A man's room waits with its locked trunk and its untouched telegram form. Another man, with a moustache, inquires, politely but leaves no trace. Dijon swears innocence. Paris swallows hours whole. The case stretched like the river in winter, slow, cold, relentless, its current hidden beneath sheets of ice. That night, unable to sleep, he walked along the Seine. The fog had lifted, but the air was heavy, saturated with the smell of damp earth and smoke. Barges loomed like dark hulks against the current. Somewhere a woman laughed too loudly, the sound thin and brittle. He leaned on the parapet, pipe glowing, and let the river carry his thoughts. The telegram lay against his chest, and he thought of its words. No passenger, no ticket, nothing found. As if a man could become nothing, as if absence itself might sign its name across the registers of two cities. He wondered whether Morel had chosen Dijon only as a ghost destination, a name to write on a ticket so that the act of buying might seem plausible. Perhaps the man with the valise had never meant to travel there. Perhaps he had needed the illusion of departure in order to vanish elsewhere. The telegram did not deny this, it merely confirmed the void. When he returned home at last, Madame Maigret had left a plate of stew on the stove, still warm under its lid. He ate in silence, listening to the muffled hum of the city outside, then sank into his chair, the pipe balanced in his hand. He thought again of the boy who had delivered the telegram, cap wet with drizzle, eyes dulled by routine. He wondered whether the boy knew that sometimes a slip of yellow paper could carry more weight than a corpse pulled from the river. And he thought of Morel, the man who had not arrived in Dijon, whose life seemed now written in absence, in gaps, in the void between two cities. Somewhere, he knew, the answer waited, patient as the locked trunk, silent as the telegram form on the desk. But for now the case remained suspended, like a shadow caught between two clocks that never struck the same hour. The fog that morning seemed thicker than usual, as if the city itself had grown reluctant to reveal its outlines. The shutters along Rue des Trois Frères were closed tight, beads of moisture clinging to their peeling paint. Maigret climbed the narrow slope slowly, his heavy shoes pressing into the damp cobbles, his pipe clenched between his teeth, though it had long since gone out. He carried with him the telegram from Dijon, folded and refolded until the creases weakened its skin, and the memory of the man with the moustache who had asked for Morel in his absence. Both weighed heavily in his coat pocket, like stones collected from a riverbed whose currents he did not yet understand. Madame Lenoir awaited him in the entry of the lodging-house. She wore the same smudged apron, the same strained bun, but her manner was sharper now, as if the hours since his last visit had grown barbs. She clutched her keys with the possessive tightness of a woman who believed control of doors meant control of truth. When she led him upstairs, the staircase groaned in protest at each step, as though it wished to warn him away from what lay behind Morel's locked door. At the threshold, she hesitated, her hand on the key. "Monsieur le Commissaire," she murmured, "I told you I had a key for safety, that is true, but—" Her eyes darted toward the dim corridor, as if expecting shadows to eavesdrop. "There are times," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I used it. Not often, not without reason." He studied her face, the sagging lines at the corners of her mouth, the nervous tremor in her eyelids. He had seen such confessions before, the half-truths of landladies who knew more of their tenants than they would admit, who guarded their lodgings like small kingdoms and considered the lives within their walls their own to interpret. "When?" he asked, his tone as even as the pipe smoke he exhaled, though the bowl was cold. "Once," she said, "when the rent was 2 days late. I found the money waiting neatly on the table, as if placed there by invisible hands. Another time, when I smelled gas, I feared for my house. I entered, but the valve was tight. The smell was from the stove in the room below. And once, yes, I opened his door when he was away, for a reason I cannot quite explain. I wished to see what kind of man I was sheltering. But the room was bare, too bare. It told me nothing." She slipped the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a sigh. The room greeted them with the same sparseness as before, the bed neatly made, the scarf folded on the chair, the trunk against the wall. Yet Maigret felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, as though the air itself had grown self-conscious under his gaze. He crossed to the trunk, the object that had tugged at him since his first visit, and ran his thick fingers along the brass fittings. "Do you have the key for this?" he asked without looking up. Her breath caught. No, she said too quickly. Then, after a pause, I mean, he never gave it to me. Tenants lock what is theirs. That is the rule. Maigret straightened, towering over her. He saw the pulse beat in her throat, fast and uneven. And yet, he said slowly, this lock has been opened more than once. Recently? Her eyes darted away toward the window where the grey light trembled. Perhaps, she murmured. Perhaps he opened it often. I heard the click at night sometimes. He was a man who guarded something. Maigret let her words hang in the room like smoke. Then with a sudden decision he reached into his coat and drew out a ring of master keys, each one worn by years of use. He knelt, tested one against the trunk's lock, then another. At the third attempt, the mechanism yielded with a reluctant click. He lifted the lid slowly, as though disturbing a sleeper. Inside lay a stack of shirts, folded with meticulous care, their collars starched, their buttons aligned. Beneath them, trousers, equally neat, then a pair of polished shoes wrapped in newspaper. At first glance, it was the luggage of any orderly clerk or travelling salesman, nothing more. But Maigret's large hand pressed deeper, disturbing the layers, until he found at the bottom a small packet wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He lifted it into the light. The paper bore the faint odour of tobacco, but when he untied the string and unfolded the wrapping, what emerged was not tobacco at all, but a collection of letters, each folded flat, each bearing the same name in delicate script, à Monsieur André Morel. No return address, no date, only the handwriting, careful, feminine, with flourishes at the ends of certain words. The ink faded, but not yet ancient. He opened one at random. It contained a few lines, nothing more. You must not write again. You must not come. If you are seen, it will ruin everything. Forget me. Another. I waited at the corner, but you did not arrive. Perhaps it is better. Perhaps we are safer. So? Another still. I dream of the sea, though I have never seen it. One day we might go, until then be cautious. He placed the letters carefully on the table. Madame Lenoir hovered at his shoulder, her breath uneven. I never touched them, she whispered. I never knew they were there. Maigret did not answer. He lit his pipe, drawing slowly until the bowl glowed red, and studied the handwriting as if it might whisper the woman's face into the room. He imagined Morel sitting here, unfolding these letters in the pale light of morning, reading the words over and over, each sentence both a promise and a warning. A woman who feared discovery, a man who obeyed by vanishing. The trunk, locked and unlocked, became not a container of possessions, but a reliquary of absence. He turned back to the landlady. You said once the smell of perfume lingered here. Her lips parted, closed, then parted again. Yes, only once, a faint trace, weeks ago. Not strong enough to say it was from a visit. Perhaps from his scarf, perhaps from the paper he touched. But I noticed. Maigret nodded. He could almost see it, a woman stepping briefly into the room, leaving nothing but the ghost of her scent. Or perhaps never stepping inside at all, only pressing her perfume into the letters so that the air seemed to remember her. He placed the letters back into their wrapping, tied the string again, and returned them to the trunk. Then he shut the lid firmly, turned the key, and slipped it into his own pocket. Madame Lenoir gasped softly, but said nothing. She seemed smaller now, diminished by the discovery, as though the second key in her hand had lost its power. On the way down the stairs, Maigret paused at the second landing. The door to the room above Morel's was ajar, and from within drifted the faint odour of stale wine. A man coughed, then cursed under his breath. The name from the ledger came back to him. Léon Brachet, the out-of-work turner. A man who lived close enough to hear locks turned in the night, close enough to smell perfume through thin walls, close enough to see visitors slip in and out if they were careless. He filed the thought away for later. For now, the letters in his pocket spoke louder than any neighbour. They told him Morel had been living two lives, one in Paris, in the rented room with its trunk and its landlady's key, the other in the shadows of a correspondence that had bound him to a woman whose fear outweighed her longing. And somewhere between those two lives, the man had disappeared. As he stepped into the street, the fog seemed to ease, revealing the outlines of Montmartre's houses, the stairways climbing into the grey sky. He lit his pipe again, the smoke curling upward, and began walking toward the Seine. The letters pressed against his chest like a second heart, beating with secrets. He did not yet know the woman's name, nor whether she belonged to Morel's Parisian life or his Dijon illusion. But he knew this. The second key had opened more than a trunk. It had unlocked the first shadow of motive. And motive, however faint, was the beginning of truth. The day stretched before him, heavy with unanswered questions, and somewhere in Paris a woman read her own words again in memory, wondering whether the man she had written to was still alive to remember them. The city had not yet awakened when Maigret left his apartment the next morning. The air clung to him like wet cloth, heavy with the residue of a night's rain. The scene moved sluggishly, its surface dull and bruised beneath the pale glimmer of lamps that had not yet been extinguished. The streets lay quiet, except for the distant rattle of a milk cart and the occasional shuffling of a man who belonged to no bed. Dawn in Paris was always the hour of truth, Maigret thought, the hour when façades still slept and men who carried secrets wore them plainly on their faces. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors smelled of tobacco and ink. Janvier was already waiting in the squad room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his coat collar still wet. He had spent half the night trailing Léon Brachet, the out-of-work turner who lived just above Morel's room. The report was thin. Brachet had staggered between cafes until closing time, drinking without enthusiasm, muttering to himself. He had spoken to no one in particular, yet when he stumbled home at last, his head bowed, he paused for a long while before Morel's locked door, as though listening. It was enough for Maigret. At 5:30, Lucas and Janvier brought Brachet in. He was a small man with shoulders bent by years of leaning over a lathe, his face grey with the chalky pallor of unemployment and drink. His hands twitched on the table before him, thick hands still stained with the ghosts of oil and metal filings. He looked around the interrogation room with wary eyes as though searching for exits, yet found only walls the colour of faded parchment. Maigret sat opposite him, his broad frame filling the chair, his pipe lit and steady. He did not begin with accusations, he never did. He let silence swell between them, heavy and intimate, until the man across the table squirmed under its weight. The only sound was the faint crackle of burning tobacco and the distant murmur of the river outside. "You knew André Morel?" Maigret said at last, his voice low, almost conversational. Brachet's eyes flickered. "A tenant. We crossed in the corridor, nothing more." His voice rasped, the voice of a man who had smoked too many cheap cigarettes and shouted too often in workshops filled with iron clamour. "You lived above him. You heard him come and go?" Brachet shrugged. "I heard many things, doors, pipes, rats. In houses like that, everything speaks." Maigret leaned forward slightly, the glow of his pipe reflected in his eyes. You heard more than doors, Monsieur Brachet. You heard a man turning a key in the night. You smelled perfume when perfume does not belong. You listened yesterday when he did not return. Tell me why." The smaller man stiffened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his lips tightening. He drummed his fingers on the table, a rhythm that betrayed his unease. "Why should I care?" he muttered. "He was not my friend." He kept to himself. Better so. Maigret let the silence return, longer this time, thick enough to choke. He puffed on his pipe, eyes never leaving Brachet's face. Outside, a church bell began to toll the hour, each stroke reverberating through the stone corridors. When the final chime faded, he spoke again. "You cared enough to linger by his door last night. You cared enough to drink without joy. You cared because you knew something." Brachet's shoulders sagged. For a moment he seemed to shrink into the chair, his bravado collapsing. He rubbed his temples with rough fingers, then whispered, "I heard voices. Once, perhaps twice. A woman's voice. Not loud, not clear. But in that house every whisper climbs the stairs. I thought it was a dream at first. But then I smelled something sweet. Not soap, not food, perfume. I knew it." Maigret waited, the smoke curling between them. "When was this?" 2 weeks ago. No, 3. I had been drinking, yes, but not so much. I heard the door close, very softly, as if someone wished to hide. After that, nothing, only silence, always silence. The inspector leaned back, his chair creaking. "And you never spoke of this?" Brachet's laugh was bitter. "To whom? The landlady? She knows more than she pretends. To the police? What would they say? That I imagine things because I drink? Perhaps they are right. But I know what I heard. A woman. And afterward, Morel was different." He walked with his head higher, as if carrying something invisible. Maigret tapped ash into the tray. "You envied him." The man's eyes widened, then lowered. His hands clenched. Perhaps. He had his rent paid, his clothes clean, his shoes polished. I had none of that. And if he had a woman, even in secret, then yes, I envied him. But envy is not a crime, commissaire. "No," Maigret agreed softly. "It is not." The silence lingered again, filled now with Brachet's laboured breathing. At last, Maigret pushed his chair back and stood, towering over the man. "You will remain here a while," he said. "Not as a criminal, as a man who has seen more than he admits. You will think, and when you are ready, you will tell me not only what you heard, but what you guessed." He left Brachet with Janvier and stepped into the corridor. The dawn light was creeping through the high windows, grey and cold. He walked to his office, poured himself a small glass of brandy, though the hour was early, and stood by the window watching the river stir. His mind replayed Brachet's words, a woman's voice, perfume, a door closing softly. Pieces of a life lived in shadow, intersecting with Morel's careful existence. When Lucas entered, Maigret handed him the telegram from Dijon and the letters taken from the trunk. "Find the paper," he instructed. "Ink, type, whatever can tell us if these came from the same hand, and find if any woman in Dijon has reason to write without signing her name." Lucas nodded and left, his footsteps echoing. The inspector returned to the interrogation room once more before sunrise fully claimed the city. Brachet still sat hunched at the table, his eyes ringed with fatigue, his hands restless. Maigret placed a steaming cup of coffee before him, the aroma filling the room. "Drink," he said simply. Brachet lifted the cup with shaking hands. After a long sip, he sighed. "She was afraid," he murmured, unprompted. Whoever she was afraid. I could hear it in the way she kept her voice low, afraid of being found, afraid of being known. And he, Morel, he wanted to keep her secret, That is why he locked his trunk, why he lived so quietly. He was guarding her, not himself. Maigret listened, saying nothing. Brachet wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. But secrets eat men alive. I know this. He was eaten even before he vanished. The inspector rose, his pipe once more between his teeth. He left Brachet to his thoughts, to his coffee, to the silence of dawn. As he stepped outside, the city had begun to stir, shutters opening, carts rolling, the clatter of hooves. Yet for Maigret the world remained caught in that peculiar stillness of early morning, when truths whisper louder than lies. And in that stillness he felt it, unmistakable. Morel's disappearance was not the act of a solitary man. It was the echo of a secret shared, of a woman's voice behind a locked door, of fear stitched into letters tied with string. Somewhere, in Paris or beyond, the other half of this silence waited. And Maigret, pipe glowing faintly against the pale dawn, knew he would have to find her. The rain had ceased by morning, but the street still bore its stains. Puddles black as ink pooled in the dips of cobblestones, gutters overflowing with the paper refuse of yesterday. The kiosks, lined up like sentinels along the boulevards, had begun their brisk trade. Newspapers hung in neat rows, their headlines bold, their ink still smudging under careless fingers. As Maigret crossed the square on his way from the Quai des Orfèvres, he noticed the way men gathered at those kiosks, clerks with briefcases, coachmen, old pensioners with collars turned up against the damp. Each man unfolded the sheet as though unveiling truth itself. But truth was never what the papers sold. It was sensation, gossip, the perfumed rumour of mystery. This morning the mystery was Morel. Double life of a Parisian clerk, one paper blared. Strange vanishing at Gare de Lyon, declared another. A third, in smaller print but no less insistent, whispered, "A woman in shadow, the hidden correspondence." The letters found in Morel's trunk, though Maigret had not released their contents, had somehow reached the ears of the press. Perhaps a whisper in the corridors of the Préfecture, perhaps the loose tongue of a clerk, perhaps simply the invention of a journalist who sensed that where a man disappeared, a woman must surely be waiting in the wings. At the Brasserie Dauphine, where he stopped for his habitual mid-morning beer, Maigret watched the scene unfold around him. Men read aloud to their companions. Women paused over their coffee to murmur speculation. Theories flowered like weeds. Morel had been a spy. Morel had a mistress in Dijon. Morel had stolen funds from his employer and fled under another name. Each version contradicted the last, yet all were received with equal credulity. It was not truth that mattered, but the thrill of believing that an ordinary man had led an extraordinary secret life. Lucas entered the brasserie with his usual brisk stride, a newspaper folded under his arm. He laid it on the table before Maigret, tapping the headline. "They'll make a circus of him, patron. Half the city will think him a scoundrel before we know whether he's dead or alive." Maigret grunted, puffing his pipe. "The papers prefer shadows. A shadow sells better than a man." He turned a page and found a crude sketch, a narrow-faced man with a valise, eyes shaded by his hat. The caption beneath read, "The man who vanished between two clocks." It was absurd and yet compelling, the kind of phrase that would lodge itself in the city's imagination. Janvier arrived soon after, carrying news from the telegraph office. "No trace of the woman's hand in Dijon," he reported. "No correspondence recorded under the name Morel. But a clerk recalled forwarding several envelopes, Paris to Lyon, to be redirected again. No names, only numbers in the corner, as if meant to confuse." Maigret nodded, absorbing the information without comment. He knew already that chasing letters across cities would lead him only deeper into shadows. It was the rumor in Paris that interested him now, the rumor that spread like smoke through cafes, through offices, through the pages of the press. Rumor had a way of coaxing truth out of silence, for those who feared exposure often revealed themselves by how quickly they protested. By afternoon, the case had become a topic for journalists at the Palais de Justice. Young men in ink-stained cuffs whispered of politics. Perhaps Morel had been entangled in some affair of state. Perhaps he carried documents too sensitive for the police to admit. Others whispered of crime syndicates, of women trafficked between Paris and the provinces, of fortunes made in counterfeit bonds. The word espionage slipped more than once into conversation. Each rumor was a garment tried on and discarded, yet each left its trace. That evening, Maigret bought 3 papers and carried them home, spreading them across the dining table like playing cards. Madame Maigret frowned at the ink they left on her clean cloth, but said nothing. While she cleared away the plates of stew, he smoked and read, his heavy brow furrowed. In each paper the tone was different, one lurid, one mocking, one almost sympathetic, but all agreed on the essential point. Morel was a man of 2 lives. Was it true? The letters suggested it, yes. Brachet's testimony of a woman's voice supported it. Yet Maigret had lived long enough to know that appearances deceive, that what looks like a double life may be nothing more than the shadow of a single, ordinary one. The press, however, had already judged. In their pages, Morel was condemned, and the city would remember him not as a missing tenant, but as a man of secrets. Later, at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret found a journalist waiting, hat in hand, eager for a statement. "Commissaire," he pressed, "is it true that a packet of letters was discovered, that a woman is involved, that espionage may be suspected?" Maigret blew a slow cloud of smoke. "It is true," he said at last, "that a man is missing." Then he turned his back and closed the door. In the solitude of his office, he stared once more at the telegram from Dijon. No passenger of description arrived, nothing found. Yet now, outside these walls, the city imagined trains filled with conspirators, women waiting in secret apartments, envelopes passed under tables, in smoky cafes. The truth had become irrelevant. Rumor had taken its place. Still, Maigret did not dismiss rumor entirely. It was dangerous, yes, but it also had a way of brushing against the real. Somewhere in the maze of speculation, a thread of fact might lie hidden, disguised as invention. His task was to listen not for the loudest voices, but for the quiet hesitation, the nervous denial, the sudden silence when a name was spoken. That night, as he walked home through the drizzle, he passed a kiosk where the last edition of the evening papers had just arrived. The headline caught his eye. "Who is the woman?" The question loomed in thick black letters, stark against the white page. Below it, speculation filled 2 columns, descriptions of women who might have been seen with Morel, anecdotes from neighbors who swore they had heard a feminine laugh in the corridor, hints of a figure glimpsed on a stairwell. All unconfirmed, all uncertain, yet all woven together with the authority of print. He paused, pipe between his teeth, and stared at the question. Who is the woman? It was the same question he carried within him, the same question the letters in his pocket asked with every silent word. The difference was that he sought the truth, while the papers sought only the thrill of the chase. But still, he admitted to himself, the city's rumor had struck the mark. Somewhere, a woman held the key to Morel's disappearance. When he finally entered his apartment, Madame Maigret was already asleep. He hung his coat, set his pipe on the table, and sat for a long while in the quiet. Outside, the rain began again, drumming softly against the window panes. He thought of Morel, the man who had bought a ticket and vanished between two clocks, the man whose letters spoke of secrecy and fear. And he thought of the city, alive with gossip, its breath carrying rumour through every café, every kiosk, every paper. Maigret understood now that the case had grown larger than a single missing man. It had become a story, a shadow play performed across the pages of Paris, and stories, once loosed into the world, took on lives of their own. He leaned back in his chair, the floor creaking beneath his weight, and let the smoke from his final pipe of the day rise toward the ceiling. Somewhere in that smoke, in that restless haze, he imagined Morel's face, blurred, uncertain, half in shadow. A man of two lives, or perhaps none at all. And he wondered, as the city wondered, whether the truth would emerge from silence or whether it would be forever smothered by rumour. The first whisper reached the Quai des Orfèvres on a Tuesday, carried not by telegram but by the mouth of a clerk from the Palais de Justice. He arrived pale, damp with the rain that fell steadily over Paris, and spoke hurriedly in the corridor outside Maigret's office. They were preparing a case in Dijon, commissaire. Not against your missing man, but with him at its centre. Then suddenly nothing, files closed, witnesses dismissed, as if the trial had never existed. Maigret listened with the expression of a man who has long since learned not to reveal how much or how little he knows. He smoked in silence until the clerk, growing nervous, excused himself. Only then did the commissaire step to his window and gaze out at the river, the rain flattening its surface. A trial that never was. Already the rumours in Paris had turned Morel into a man of intrigue. Now it seemed Dijon wished to play its own hand. The following day, Maigret boarded the train south again. The carriages smelled of wet wool and coal smoke, of chickens packed in crates at the far end. He sat alone, his pipe unlit, staring through the blurred glass at villages that hunched under the weight of the rain. He thought of Morel, of the letters hidden in the trunk, of Brachet's testimony about a woman's voice. Each fact remained stubbornly isolated, like islands in a fog-bound sea. Somewhere a bridge connected them, but he had yet to find it. At Dijon the courthouse stood square and solemn, its stone façade streaked with water. Inside, the corridors smelled of ink, damp wood, and the faint vinegar tang of old documents. Maigret requested to see the magistrate, a tired man with a grey moustache and watery eyes. They spoke in an office lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of dossiers. There was talk of a trial, Maigret said. The magistrate hesitated. His fingers toyed with the stem of his spectacles. Talk, yes, preparation perhaps, but nothing official. And yet witnesses were summoned, the man sighed. You have your ways of knowing. Very well. A small matter, hardly worth your journey. A provincial fraud involving accounts, false signatures. Nothing extraordinary. Morel's name was mentioned. The magistrate's eyes slid away. It's not formally. A witness thought he recognized him in Léon years ago, but when pressed he grew uncertain. Such things happen. Memory is unreliable. And then, as suddenly as it arose, the matter was closed. By whose order? The magistrate removed his spectacles, polished them with unnecessary care, and set them down. By no order I could name. Sometimes cases dissolve of their own accord. Paperwork misplaced, interest withdrawn, you understand. Maigret understood too well. He had seen cases vanish like smoke before, files disappearing, witnesses recanting, magistrates instructed to look the other way. Such dissolutions were never innocent. He rose, thanked the man, and left without shaking his hand. In the records office, he found clerks reluctant to meet his gaze. A young woman finally admitted that several depositions had been taken, then transferred to Paris, though she could not say where. "Men came," she whispered, "with the proper seals. They took the files. Since then, we have heard nothing." That evening, Maigret walked the damp streets of Dijon, his hat pulled low. He entered a small tavern near the station, its ceiling low, its air thick with the smell of boiled meat and garlic. There he questioned quietly, speaking with men who remembered names. At last he heard it, Morel's name, spoken with hesitation. A man resembling him had once been accused of forging documents in Lyon. Not convicted, not even formally charged, but suspected. And then silence. The commissaire drank his wine slowly, considering. A double life indeed, one life in Paris, quiet, orderly, tenant in a Montmartre lodging house. Another in the provinces, entangled in fraud, whispered about in courtrooms, almost brought to trial. And between the two, a woman's voice, fearful, pleading for secrecy. When he returned to Paris, the rain followed him. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he found Lucas waiting with the results of his inquiries into the letters. "The paper comes from a stationer near the Madeleine," Lucas reported. "The ink is of a type used in schools and offices, nothing to distinguish. But the handwriting, it is educated, refined, not the hand of a seamstress or a shopgirl." Maigret nodded. It fit what he had begun to suspect. The woman was of a different world than Morel's lodging house, perhaps even than his fraudulent ventures. She was someone with more to lose, someone whose fear was greater than her desire. The following days brought confirmation of what he had already sensed. Rumours spread through the Palais de Justice. A trial had indeed been prepared, but its papers had vanished into Paris. Some said the ministry itself had intervened. Others whispered of powerful interests, of names that must not appear in the press. The city, always eager for scandal, now hummed with the suggestion that Morel's disappearance was tied not to love or chance, but to corruption. At the Brasserie Dauphine, Janvier read aloud from the latest edition of Le Matin, "Mystery clerk linked to financial scandal." The article hinted at ministries, at high offices, at connections too delicate to name. "They are building him into a monster," Janvier muttered. Maigret said nothing. He puffed his pipe and let the smoke cloud his features. In his pocket the letters still rested, fragile, secret, speaking not of scandals or ministries, but of fear and longing. He believed in them more than in the rumours. Yet the trial that never was, the vanished depositions, the silent magistrate, these were not inventions. They pointed to forces larger than one man's love affair. Late one night, long after the office had emptied, Maigret sat alone, rereading the telegram from Dijon. He unfolded it carefully, though he knew its words by heart. No passenger of description arrived, no ticket presented, nothing found. He placed it beside the letters, the ink of fear mingling with the ink of denial. A man disappears between two clocks. A trial vanishes between two courts, both absences heavy, both demanding explanation. The river outside murmured in the darkness. He leaned on the sill, pipe glowing faintly, and thought of Morel. Was he a criminal who had escaped justice, or a man crushed between powers greater than himself? Was he still alive, sheltered by the woman who wrote those letters, or had he been erased like the files in Dijon, his life folded away in silence? The case had grown larger than the missing man. It had become a shadow stretching from Paris to the provinces, from shabby lodging houses to marble ministries, and yet, Maigret knew, the truth would not be found in rumours or vanished files. It would be found in the small human details. A scarf left on a chair, a button fallen from a shirt, a landlady's second key. He had learned long ago that the grandest scandals rested on the smallest cracks. He closed the window, leaving the river to its night, and returned to his desk. Tomorrow he would begin again, not with the trial that never was, but with the woman who had written, "You must not write again. Forget me." For in her fear lay the clearest path through the fog. And somewhere in Paris, he felt certain, she still lived, still wrote, still feared. The Quai des Orfèvres smelled of damp stone that morning, and the smoke from too many pipes lingered stubbornly in the low ceilings. Outside, the Seine flowed with the sluggish heaviness of winter, its barges moving like weary beasts beneath the bridges. Maigret sat at his desk, staring at 2 ledgers laid open before him, each more eloquent in its silences than in its entries. The first was the landlady's book, the one Madame Lenoir guarded with the fervour of a parish priest tending his missal. The neat loops of ink recorded every rent paid, every arrear circled, every departure marked with a cross. André Morel's name appeared with the precision of a metronome. 2nd of the month, 2nd of the month, 2nd of the month. Always notes, never coins. Always in full. A man who guarded not only his room, but also his punctuality, as though regularity itself were his disguise. The second ledger came from Dijon, obtained through a clerk whose conscience had outweighed his caution. It was an account book from a small firm of exporters, wine mostly, with occasional dealings in bonds. In its pages appeared a name written once as André M. and another time as Morel A., both attached to transactions now struck through with a neat red line. The dates matched those when he had lived in Paris. Here, too, was a pattern. Withdrawals small enough to escape attention, deposits just irregular enough to unsettle a watchful accountant. 2 ledgers, 2 lives. One precise, one evasive. Together they sketched a man divided, a tenant who lived in Montmartre with his trunk and his silence, and a shadow who moved in Dijon among numbers that no longer balanced. Maigret lit his pipe, the first match sputtering before catching. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking, and let the smoke rise toward the ceiling. His thoughts moved slowly, deliberately, like barges turning in a current. Morel was no ordinary clerk. He was a man who had measured his steps, concealed his traces, and yet, like all men, left marks in ink and in memory. He summoned Janvier and Lucas, spreading the 2 ledgers across the desk. "Look," he said simply, "here he pays as a tenant. Here he signs as a businessman. Which is he?" Janvier frowned, rubbing his jaw. "Both, perhaps." Lucas grunted. "Or neither. If one life is a mask, which one?" "That," Maigret said, puffing at his pipe, "is the question." In the café near the station he questioned the clerks who had sold tickets. One recalled Morel fumbling coins, another remembered the way he folded the paper twice before hiding it in his coat. They spoke as if of a ghost, already forgetting the exact shape of his face. In Montmartre, Madame Lenoir insisted her tenant was respectable, too respectable, the kind of man who left no scent, except once, when perfume lingered faintly in the corridor. In Dijon, the magistrate had tried to dismiss him as a passing name, a shadow struck through in red. Yet both cities had inscribed him in their books, both claimed and denied him at once. Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, with rain soaking his coat and fatigue heavy in his limbs. He poured himself a small glass of brandy and studied the ledgers again. The handwriting in Dijon was neat, deliberate, controlled. The signatures in Paris, when he found them on receipts from the tailor in the café, were the same hand, but with subtle differences. One carried the flourish of someone proving himself. The other was restrained, as if wishing to disappear. It was Lucas who first voiced the thought that had been forming unspoken. "Suppose there are two Morels," he said, half joking. "Brothers, perhaps. One lives quietly in Paris, the other plays games in Dijon. When one life grows dangerous, the other provides refuge." Maigret shook his head slowly. "No, it is one man, but a man who learned to divide himself. A man who practiced 2 handshakes, 2 smiles, 2 signatures, and perhaps one day forgot which was true." The commissaire closed the ledgers and rose, pacing the room. His steps echoed against the stone floor. He thought of Brachet, the out-of-work turner, listening at night to whispers behind thin walls. He thought of the woman's letters, pleading for caution, speaking of the sea she had never seen. He thought of the trunk, locked and unlocked, containing not treasures, but traces. And he thought of the trial that had never been, the witnesses dismissed, the files vanished into Paris. The pieces did not yet fit. But the ledgers told him this much: Morel had balanced himself between 2 worlds until the scales tipped. One life was neat, punctual, obedient. The other was unstable, fraudulent, fragile. Somewhere in that imbalance lay the reason he had disappeared. That night, in the Brasserie Dauphine, Maigret sat at his usual table while rain streaked the windows. The mirror behind the counter warped the faces of the patrons, each man reflected with a flaw. He imagined Morel sitting here, the narrow shoulders bent over a glass, wondering which reflection belonged to him, the quiet tenant or the evasive clerk. Perhaps the mirror itself had grown restless, refusing to keep his image steady. The city still buzzed with rumour. The papers spoke of espionage, of scandal in high offices, of secret women. Yet Maigret trusted the ledgers more than the press. Ink did not lie, though men did. The numbers told of a life stretched too thin, of a man who had lived in 2 columns, debit and credit, never reconciling them. As the hour grew late, he left the brasserie and walked along the Seine. The lamps flickered in the mist, their reflections trembling on the water. He thought of the 2 ledgers, of the 2 signatures, of the 2 clocks at the Gare de Lyon. Always 2s, never 1. A man divided, a man whose balance sheet could never close. Back in his office, he opened the Dijon ledger once more. A final entry caught his eye, half erased but still legible. Transfer pending. No amount, no date, no signature to complete it. Only those 2 words, suspended unfinished. A transfer from one account to another, or from one life to another. He closed the book and leaned heavily on the desk. The case pressed on him like the fog outside, dense, impenetrable, yet charged with the certainty that something waited just beyond sight. Morel had lived in 2 ledgers, yes, but which one had he chosen in the end? Which account had claimed him, the one marked in neat ink, or the one struck through in red? As dawn approached, Maigret lit his pipe once more and watched the river from his window. The barges moved silently in the half-light, carrying their hidden loads. And he knew that Morel, too, carried something still unseen, something that had forced him to vanish between 2 clocks, between 2 cities, between 2 lives. The fog had returned to Paris that evening, creeping over the quays and gathering in the narrow alleyways like a whispered secret. The air smelled of damp earth and burnt wood, the remnants of the day's rain mingling with the smoke from chimneys. Maigret stood at the Quai des Orfèvres, his coat pulled tight against the chill, and looked across the river, where the lamps cast their yellowed halos on the water's surface, rippling gently with the movement of unseen barges. This was how Paris should be, he thought, silent, patient, heavy with the weight of its own history. A city that never hurried but always remembered. Morel, too, had seemed like the city in that way, a man who moved through life with purpose, but whose steps had always been too quiet, too careful, as if waiting for something to pass by without notice. The case had come full circle, or so it seemed. The question of Morel's disappearance had stretched across months, through quiet cafes and busy train stations, through letters and ledgers, through the murmur of rumors in the press. Maigret had followed the trail through shadows and half-truths, but now the fog of uncertainty felt heavier than ever. He had followed the scent of perfume, the whisper of a woman's voice, the broken record of a man who lived two lives. Yet as the night thickened around him, he could not see the final shape of the story. The last of the witnesses had spoken. The landlady, Madame Lenoir, had sworn she knew nothing more than she had already told him. Brachet, the turner, had muttered his grudging confession and disappeared into the night. The letters from Morel's trunk had offered only a glimpse of a life suspended between fear and desire, and yet Maigret felt the case had not yet found its resolution. The pieces fit too neatly, too perfectly, as if someone had placed them there on purpose. That was never the way with his cases. They were always more tangled than they appeared at first. The city was growing quieter as the last few pedestrians hurried to their homes, their footsteps echoing faintly on the damp cobbles. Maigret turned and walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his steps slow, measured. There was no rush now. The answers would come when they were ready. Inside the building, the atmosphere was heavier than usual. The officers at their desks seemed more subdued, their conversations softer, as if they too had sensed the case nearing its end. Maigret entered his office and found it empty. He sat at his desk, the papers before him now familiar and tired. The ledgers, the telegrams, the reports, each one laid out like the layers of a book he had read too many times. His thoughts returned to the letters, the woman's fear, and Morel's deliberate life. What was it that had caused him to disappear? Had he really been a man torn between two lives, each more fragile than the last? Had he been a man hunted by his own need for secrecy, or had someone with more power, more influence, forced his hand? Maigret couldn't decide. The more he thought about it, the more the story seemed to shift, like the fog itself, which refused to settle into any one shape. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the river once more. The fog had thickened, and the lights on the water had begun to blur. In the distance, a lone figure walked along the quay, silhouetted against the pale glow of the street lamps. The figure moved with purpose, but Maigret couldn't make out the face. A passerby, perhaps, or someone like him. Someone who had waited too long for a resolution and was now caught in the same inescapable current of the city. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Lucas standing in the doorway, his face drawn. "Monsieur Maigret," Lucas said quietly, "there's something you should see." Maigret followed Lucas down the narrow hallway, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and ink. They descended 2 flights of stairs, and then Lucas led him to a small room where a single officer was waiting. In the officer's hands was an envelope, its edges worn and smudged. He handed it over wordlessly. Maigret tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was short, written in the same delicate script as the other letters he had found in Morel's trunk. "I am sorry. I have tried to protect you for too long. But now the decision is yours. Leave Paris. Leave everything behind. There are others who will not stop until they find you." Maigret read the words again, slower this time. A final message from the woman who had written Morel's letters, the woman whose fear had echoed through his thoughts for weeks. And yet, even in her words, there was no clarity. Who was she? Why had she written this? "I don't understand," Maigret muttered, his voice thick with the weight of frustration. "What does this mean?" Lucas stepped closer. "It's the same handwriting, sir, the same paper." The words echoed in Maigret's mind. "Leave Paris! Leave everything behind!" But why now? Why hadn't Morel gone if he truly feared something, someone? Why had he chosen this path, this game of shadows, instead of disappearing quietly into the night? Maigret felt a cold weight settle in his chest, a quiet realization creeping up on him. Morel had not disappeared by accident. He had made a choice. He had chosen to leave behind the life in Montmartre, the small, controlled life he had built for himself, and to step into a world that would never allow him peace. The question was why. The woman's message held an urgency that Maigret could not ignore. She had been speaking not just to Morel, but to him. She had left this letter not to explain herself, but to push Maigret toward a conclusion he had not yet reached. Maigret stood silent for a moment, letting the weight of the letter settle over him. Then he turned to Lucas. "Find her," he said softly. "Find her, and find her quickly. We are not dealing with an ordinary disappearance. We are dealing with a man who has stepped into a world where nothing is what it seems. He is not hiding from his past. He's running from something worse." As Lucas left the room, Maigret returned to the window, his gaze fixed on the Seine below. The fog had not lifted. The night was deepening, the city swathed in its usual veil of mystery. He felt the case closing in on him, the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place, yet still too elusive to grasp. The woman's message had been clear, but the answer was still lost in the fog, just beyond his reach. In the quiet of the office, with the faint light of the lamps filtering through the mist, Maigret stood alone, surrounded by the echoes of a man's life split in two, and the shadow of a woman's fear that had never fully revealed itself. The night seemed to stretch forever before him, endless and full of half-formed answers, all leading to a place where only Morel could speak the truth. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. The city was waking up again, but Maigret knew that for him the night was just beginning. The fog would clear when it was ready, and when it did, the truth would be waiting on the other side. But for now, it remained hidden, like the face of a man who had chosen to disappear between two lives, forever lost in the shadows of Paris.